Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 52 of the Ask Historians podcast. 52, as we all know, is the number of years in a Mesoamerican calendar round, so please go out to your nearest star hill and start a fire in someone's chest to bring back to the city and relight all the fires there. However, if you happen to have different ways of celebrating the new year, please do that instead. This episode is coming out on Christmas Day, so Merry Christmas to those of you who celebrate, and those of you who don't, give it a shot. You get presents. So this is not exactly a very Christmassy episode, though. It just kind of, the production schedule just kind of worked out the fact that today we are talking about Jonestown, which is one of the largest mass suicides in history. A very cheerful thing. But the show must go on, and again, that's just kind of the way the production schedule worked out. Before we go on and talk about the subject, though, I want to thank our contributors to our Patreon, the Ask Historians Patreon. That would be Matt F., Max M., Elm, and Vlad. Thank you all so very much. We are, in fact, very close to meeting our basic hosting costs for the podcast, at which point we'll branch out and get ourselves a pro SoundCloud account so we can have our full back catalog on there as well. And after that, we'll probably start branching out into looking at maybe doing kind of a giveaway of a relevant history book. Once a month or something like that, some sort of raffle or drawing or something like that. But in the meantime, we're thinking small and we're chugging along. So thank you all who have participated in the Patreon. That's patreon.com/AskHistorians if you want to go by and help support the show. But on to the show itself. Today we are talking with Cordus Mellum about Jonestown, the People's Temple, and Jim Jones. All names that you probably heard if you've ever heard the expression drinking the Kool-Aid. So we'll dive into that now.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ask Historians podcast. I am back here once again with Cordus Mellum, and previously we talked about the Great Leap Forward in Communist China, but today we're going to talk about a little bit of a different subject, which is the People's Temple. Most commonly known for the Jonestown mass suicide and the Reverend Jim Jones as a cult leader, and of course the phrase drinking a Kool-Aid, but we're going to be taking a slightly different approach to looking at it. So Cordus, why don't you go ahead and give us an idea about what we're going to be focusing on here?
Well, most of the story about People's Temple and Jonestown has always been centered on the figure of Jim Jones himself. Much of studies have been about how Jim Jones was a megalomaniac, how he was a paranoid hypochondriac, how he was a cynical bastard who didn't really believe what he believed in, like his mental illness, his sexual habits, all this other stuff, all about Jim Jones. We are not talking about Jim Jones. We'll talk about Jim Jones when today's podcast intersects with him. However, this podcast will not be about Jim Jones. Instead, this podcast is going to be about how the people of People's Temple itself.
So why don't you go ahead and give us an introduction about what the People's Temple is?
Most people, when they do not know what People's Temple is in the current generation. This is mostly because we mostly erased it from cultural memory.
Except for the Kool-Aid, of course.
Except for the Kool-Aid, of course. Yes. When most people think about People's Temple, they mostly think about Jonestown. And when people think about Jonestown, they think about the mass deaths at Jonestown, and the Kool-Aid, and the cyanide, probably the human rights violations, and pretty much that's literally the cultists who drank the Kool-Aid. People's Temple was not literally, they were literally a group who literally drank the Kool-Aid.
Well, Flavor Aid, anyway.
Yes. Flavor Aid. But that was not what they set out to be when they got started in the 1950s. People's Temple was originally a church organization. It was affiliated with the Disciples of Christ, but its beliefs and styles and methods of worshiping were Pentecostal. It was rooted in the Pentecostal tradition. Furthermore, People's Temple, when it got started, was originally a church for Black and white people. It was originally an integrated church where people of different races could come together and worship without being judged by their race.
Yeah, and so this was started back in the 1950s, you said, right?
Yes, 1950s.
But so it started in the 1950s in Indianapolis, which is not really a time or place that you would think about religious integration of the races? Because, even now today, of course, churches tend to be very, very segregated by race. So what was the impetus of creating this integrated Pentecostal style church?
Well, the integrated Pentecostal style church, the story goes, is that Jones was a preacher at this Laurel Street Tabernacle, which is a Methodist church. And they wanted to hire him as their preacher when the current head preacher retired, except for the fact that this was a very, very white church. And Jim Jones, he identified a lot with the Black community. And so in his services, he would invite Black members, not just to sit in the back, but to come up and sit in the front row with him. And this did not make the church elders very happy. So, they basically kicked him out because he was, they gave an ultimatum, actually. They said, you can preach to Black people. It just has to be a separate Black church. So you be preaching to a white congregation and then a Black congregation. And Jones didn't like that, so he walked out. And when he walked out, he took the number of the white congregation members with him. And with that, he started at what was originally called the Community Unity Church. And this Community Unity Church was, of course, founded as an integrated church. He, of course, would go down and invite members of the Black community to join his church, and therefore, boom.
Now, when you said that it is kind of not officially, although not officially a Pentecostal church, it was heavily influenced by that. And I think most people, when they think of Pentecostalism or that kind of evangelical strain that is associated with it, they think of things like speaking in tongues, handling snakes, faith healing. I mean, was that going on from the beginning?
Well, a lot of what Jim Jones did to draw people into church was pretty much his evangelical faith stuff. Even before, when he founded his own church, he did his thing in various biblical revival fundamentalist churches. There's a story that goes around that says that, when he was at one of these conferences, a lady pointed at him and said, you will found yourself a great church or something like that. And then he went up and he started prophesizing people's social security numbers and phone numbers and healing people left and right and all that stuff. And these elements were very, very, very prominent in the Indianapolis church. Nevertheless, even though the faith healings and the prophecy were a very big draw to the church, he himself had said, you can't just go to church because of the faith healings and stuff. You also have to love your Black brothers and sisters. If you didn't love your Black brothers and Black sisters, we don't want you here, even if you were really, really dedicated to the faith healings and stuff. He wanted to make sure that the people who were in his church were dedicated to the idea of integration.
It seems like from the beginning there was kind of this strong kind of social and political message to the People's Temple, although it wasn't, of course, called the People's Temple at that time. But it seemed like there was a mixing here of religion and politics, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Also, as a point of clarification, the church quickly renamed itself to the Wings of Deliverance, and then after that to People's Temple. So, it was known in Indianapolis as People's Temple for most of the time when it was there. Mm-hmm. It's just that when it was initially founded, it was initially founded as Community Unity, and then it got renamed.
Yeah. So, how successful was this as an integrated church? I mean, what was the in the early days? What were the demographics like?
In the early days, I would say the demographics were about 1/5 Black, and then the rest of them were white. His church would go around the Black community, passing around flyers, knocking on doors, to invite Black people to their church. And of course, a lot of white people were interested because of his evangelicalist faith. But like I said before, Jim Jones didn't want people just for their faith. He wanted people for their faith, and also if they cared about integration and about caring for their racial brothers and sisters. So,
I mean, was that a draw to to pull people in the Black community away from their traditional Black churches? Was that promise of integration, was that a draw and an appeal to them as well?
It appealed for a lot of people, but the big draw didn't actually happen until after they moved to California. But even before then, there were a number of Black congregations who saw People's Temple as this church of where Black and white people could pray side by side. And remember, this is in the 1950s. This is in the 1950s, and if I recall correctly, this was before Brown and Board of Education. Or actually, no, it might be after, because Yeah, I think it was after his church was involved in some integration stuff.
Yeah, and this is also in Indiana, which, during the night, just a generation or two before, had literally been run by the Klan.
Yes. So Indianapolis was literally pretty damn white. It was run by the Klan, and there was this integrated church right there trying to say, you know what? Black people are our brothers too. We should invite them to church and have them sit next to us and be together in racial and faithful harmony.
Yeah, but presumably these kind of social efforts weren't contained to the pulpit. I mean, this is a people's temple and a community church. So what were they doing out in the community?
Well, in the community, People's Temple would basically, they didn't just preach the social gospel, like they actually practiced the social gospel. At one point, they were running a free restaurant for poor people who didn't have enough money to eat. They were loaning out clothes, like nice clothes, for people to borrow. So that way, when they went to job interviews, they can look respectable. Like, members of People's Temple went out there, and when Jim Jones was the Indianapolis Human Rights Chairman, and helped to integrate a few restaurants, a hospital ward, a couple other things like that. They ran nursing care centers because Jim Jones believed that the nursing care centers at the time sucked. And so therefore, he was going to open his own center and treat seniors with respect. Whether they actually treated the seniors like with better respect may be debated because of like the whole cult thing.
Yeah, but I mean, at this point, in describing this kind of early days and these early ideals, I'm like, well, sign me up. Sounds like a great church to go to,
Yeah, exactly.
In, racial harmony and doing good social works and working out in the community. You also mentioned that they had also moved to San Francisco. I mean, was there simply, were they not finding fertile ground for that message in Indianapolis, or what caused the move to California?
Part of it could actually be, well, they didn't literally move to San Francisco first. They moved to Redwood Valley and Ukiah. Part of the move was because of, like, they really did believe that California was more liberal, and so their message would be more acceptable there. Part of the other reason was that Jim Jones at the time was preaching in that there was going to be a nuclear holocaust. Because also, don't forget, this was the 1950s.
Yeah, this is height of Cold War, yeah.
Yeah, and like by the time they actually moved, this was like, I believe in the 1960s or 1970s. We're still in the Cold War. And we were still freaking damn scared that there were going to be nuclear bombs that were going to go blow us up. So he prophesied that there was going to be a nuclear holocaust and that they should move out Indianapolis as soon as possible, to go to Ukiah, which was incidentally listed on this magazine article published by Esquire about the 9 safest places to be in case of a nuclear holocaust. So presumably safe from nuclear fallout. And also it was in a more liberal state that people could actually easily access to, especially since many of the other places were like Hawaii or Belo Horizonte, Brazil, which is...
So yeah, Ukiah was a little more accessible than Hawaii or Brazil. So I think one of the other strains that goes through the message of the People's Temple, which you haven't really talked about yet, is this idea of socialism and communism as well. Was that present during the Indianapolis times, or is that something that comes out of this time in California?
A lot of the early publications of People's Temple, they actually did run an article that said that they were not anti-communist at first, and that like communism was anti-American and therefore bad. But in a later interview with Jim Jones, he said he was honest about his being a pretty socialist leading person, if not communist. And definitely by the time he got to San Francisco, he was very, very, very frank about his being a communist, about his being a liberal. And he himself said nobody who regularly attended his services would not have known that he was a communist, because he basically talked about his communist and his liberal leaning beliefs for ages at this point. It was very, very clear that he was a communist. And he himself claimed that he was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party of the United States since before he was even a preacher in Indianapolis.
Yeah, so were his opinions, were his political views, were they church dogma at the time? I guess the corollary to that question is, we think of this as being, this megalomaniacal cult, this cult
Yeah.
centered on Jim Jones, but was it that from the start where his opinions were indistinguishable from the actual church practices?
Well, it is true that Jim Jones basically ran the church, and a lot of people's attraction to People's Temple, besides the social works and besides the racial harmony and besides the faith stuff, was also Jim Jones. The Moore family, whose two daughters were very prominent in the temple leadership, noted in their letters that there was this weird sort of idolatry of Jim Jones. In one of their daughters' letters, Caroline Layton, they mentioned in the letters to each other that they thought Carolyn was replacing her personal ideas and beliefs about politics and stuff with what her preacher, Jim Jones, believed.
So there was kind of this strain from the start that, joining the temple would, you'd kind of start absorbing a lot of the personality there.
Yes, but nevertheless, Jim Jones also did believe in doing good works. Mm-hmm. And his socialist beliefs, his communist beliefs, he justified with various passages in the Bible. Specifically, there's a couple of passages in, I believe, the Synoptic Gospels where Jesus himself will call on his apostles, say, give up your family, give up your property, give up everything, and follow me.
Yeah, because this is also the time of liberation theology and a lot of mixing of kind of Marxism and Christianity as well, even in more mainline congregations.
Exactly. The Methodist Church themselves were promoting the social gospel in the works, and there are many passages of the Bible which can be used to justify doing social works and promoting this social gospel of it's not just about us, it's also us helping people in need as well.
So when they moved from Indianapolis to California, were they living in kind of a biblical sense of giving up their possessions to join the church, living communally, kind of thing like that?
Yeah, you can argue that they were not literally forced to give up their possessions and live communally. However, there was this expectation of, especially for members who were part of the planning commission of the temple, pretty much like the people who did staff work and stuff, the leaders. They had a much higher expectation of their going communal.
Yeah, so there was the leadership then was kind of giving up their possessions and expected to, I guess, pay very high tithes and things like that.
Yes, so many of them would actually give up their actual jobs and work for the temple full time without pay. Instead of actually getting paid wages, they get allowances and they have food and board paid for by the temple because they lived communal. Other people, they kept their jobs, but it was as if they were running two jobs. The first one being money in order to donate all that money to the temple. The other one being a temple job where they basically stayed up all night doing whatever it is the temple needed to do.
Yeah, but how many people are we talking about here, actually? So, when the move from Indianapolis to Ukiah happens, how many members of the church are there?
It's around 100 people. I want to say 150 people, roughly. But it's a little over, but it's definitely over 100 people. It's arguably, it's rather large. But considering the fact that in Indianapolis, Jim Jones had members, several thousand members at that point, this wasn't actually a very large group.
Mm-hmm. So, did the church continue in Indianapolis?
Well, basically, their charters within the church, within Indianapolis, that their tax exempted charters expired because they, in the 1970s, because they hadn't been filling in their required tax exemption forms or something like that. But the People's Temple members have an outpost there for some time before they shut it down.
Mm-hmm.
In addition,
but the main focus is on California now.
Yeah, the main focus was in California. On their cross-country trips to get more members to join their church, they did occasionally stop in Indianapolis to come visit. But for the most part, most of the activity was focused in California. And at some point, the Indianapolis church did get shut down.
Yeah, and so from Ukiah, apparently I would guess Ukiah being Ukiah, there's not a lot of people to convert there, so they started getting involved a lot with San Francisco, correct? San Francisco, Los Angeles, hitting the major population centers.
Well, when they got to Ukiah, initially they had a really hard time getting a building themselves. They had to borrow a number of buildings a couple times over the years. And while they did get some converts from the Ukiah population, yes, most of the converted were from urban centers such as San Francisco and later Los Angeles.
Yeah, and so were they building temples there as well? Like actual
Yes,
buildings? Yeah.
yes, they actually did have actual buildings in both San Francisco and Los Angeles. The San Francisco one burnt down in the 1980s, so it's not physically present there now. But the Los Angeles one, I believe, still exists.
Well, there presumably is something else right now.
Yeah, right now I believe I believe at the moment it's being run as like a Korean community church or something like that. But
Is the People's Temple getting involved with, doing their kind of social outreach, running and doing things like what they were doing back in Indianapolis, so like, setting up senior centers and nursing and restaurants and things like that?
yeah, they were. They continued the programs that they started in Indianapolis. They also opened like a free legal clinic. They ran kind of a couple of health clinics as well, where people could get free like sickle cell anemia checks and pap smears. And they had like I said, free legal aid clinics. They would also serve as welfare advocates because many of their members were eligible for welfare. They helped to advocate for these people in order to help them get their welfare benefits. In addition, besides all of that, they also started getting involved in politics.
Yeah, that was actually when I was doing my background research for this. I was, I'd always kind of known that like the People's Temple got involved in this San Francisco political scene, but I was a little surprised at how much.
Yeah, they did a lot of political work. Even Ukiah, they assisted in a number of political campaigns in the Ukiah community. Although at the time when they were in Ukiah, they were helping Republican candidates rather than the Democratic ones. When they got to San Francisco proper, they switched their allegiance to the Democrats, to the more liberal coalition. And they did a lot of campaign work. They involved themselves in so many different campaigns. Like they donated money to the American and Cancer Association. They donated money to free number of leftist leaders, such as like Angela Davis and Denny Banks and Denny Banks' wife, I believe Huey Newton as well.
Yeah, and they were associating with luminaries in the San Francisco political scene like Harvey Milk as well.
Yes. They actually helped in a campaign that would eventually get Moscone elected. And of course, Harvey Milk was part of Moscone's state, and like he himself got office because of Moscone. And Moscone's campaign was held by People's Temple. And of course, People's Temple helped out like free speech campaigns, things like freedom of the press. Hey, they offered to donate money to like when Patricia Hearst got kidnapped by, I believe, the Symbionese Liberation Army. I'm sorry, I'm gonna get the name wrong.
I don't think anyone actually knows how to pronounce Symbionese Liberation Army. It is a bit of a tongue twister, but yeah. But so they're getting really heavily involved in the political scene as well. But having moved from Indianapolis and now kind of establishing itself in broadly in California, you would mention that a lot of the parishioners were eligible for welfare, but this is also kind of the height of the hippie movement as well. So what kind of people were being attracted into the church? Do we see some significant people who would play later roles?
Yes. Like it's not just the hip, like out of the Black community, we get a lot of older seniors who were attracted to the faith side, the fundamentalist side of Jim Joseph's church. And we also get younger people as well. People who are attracted to his political message. The same thing happened on the white side. We also get a lot of white singers who were attracted because of the faith stuff, and a lot of younger people, like college age students, high school students, like people a little bit older college age, the people who will be part of like anti-war movement. And many of the people who will later graduate to become members of the Planning Commission were from this group of white, well-educated liberals who dedicated themselves to the church because they believed in socialism, because they believed in ending racism and sexism. And
You had mentioned that the planning commission, you see a lot of people who are coming into that leadership position who are very kind of, white, well, better off than most and well educated. So, I mean, was this kind of a situation where it was an integrated church, but the leadership was still very white?
pretty much. There was a letter by a group of defectors in the early 1970s. They're known as the A Revolutionaries. They left behind a letter explaining why they left and what their problems were with the church. And one of their main problems was that there was almost no Black leadership, and that white people got promoted to leadership positions faster than the Black members of the church who had been there for years and years and years. And this was one of the main complaints outside of the whole, oh, you focus too much on sex. Where's the socialism? Why do we always focus on sex? And
Yeah,
why do we
actually,
always...
so the other thing I wanted to ask about, what was the role of women in the church? Because, I mean, this still was a very kind of fundamentalist church, but at the same time, it's advocating a lot of kind of radical, socialist-inspired social policies as well.
Yeah. The role of women in People's Temple is relatively complicated in that a lot of white women particularly found leadership positions within People's Temple, which allowed them to exercise skills and displayed their abilities in such a way that might not have been available outside the church, especially since this is the early days of the feminist movement. Many of the planning commissions and staff members were white women. It was also extremely gendered within this planning commission. As the letter from the A Revolutions hints at, a lot of the focus within this planning commission was about sex. And of course, Jim Jones, being Jim Jones, he was not exactly a saint either on this front, in that People's Temple officially advocated abstinence for the good of socialism. Nevertheless, Jim Jones also had many affairs with many of the women in leadership positions.
Was this kind of topics of discussion? I mean, what were the discussions they were having about sex? Or was Jim Jones' dalliances, I guess you could say, were those an open secret? How were they handled?
Well, Jim Jones he actually did admit to his church that he did have sex. However, his justification was that he did this sexual act as a sacrifice for his followers. It was basically phrased in such a way that I am having sex because I love these people, and this is my way of making sure that they stay in the fold and that they are more dedicated to socialist ideals than they would have been had I not had sex with them.
How very, very noble of him.
Yes, how very, very, very noble.
So,
And,
but also during this time, as we kind of go forward, some of the more dubious practices start to get kind of leaked. Because you mentioned there had been that group of defectors earlier, the revolutionaries, who it seemed like their message was the church wasn't socialist enough. But there were other defectors as well who really were just who were defecting because they were this is maybe a little too cultish.
There were a number of defectors who left for many different reasons. Many of them, they liked the initial message of the church, but they defected because of some of the practices behind the scenes that didn't sit right with them. Things like beatings. They actually did beatings and catharsis sessions amongst the planning commission group.
And what are the catharsis sessions?
Well, catharsis session. Okay, so I'm gonna start off with explaining what this is in the context of more communist movements. In that it's basically you call out someone on the floor and castigate them in public about how their wrongdoings, and everyone's allowed to basically tell them off for their own wrongdoings, and the person who's basically in the center is basically being humiliated by the entire community because it wasn't just a sin against the other person, it was a sin against the entire community as a whole. Therefore, their wrongdoing in order to be corrected, must also be done in public. And so that's essentially what catharsis session does. This is basically what was happening in People's Temple itself. They called people out on the middle floor, and then they say accuse them of doing something that violated what they believed to be socialist communist ideals. Oh, you had sex with your husband and you weren't supposed to do that. Or you had a drink and you're not technically supposed to drink in the temple. And then, of course, then it gets more serious. Like you said a slur word against this black woman. You used the N-word. There was actually one case, I believe, where someone actually got called up to the floor because they were harassing a 12-year-old who something about sex. Apparently, the result of that particular one was nasty because it had something to do with a rubber hose.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask. So, like, after these kind of public sessions where all your wrongdoings are listed, I would assume, of course, the traditional religious thing would be do some sort of penance.
Yeah.
So, what kind of punishments were handed down as a result of these?
We're kind of starting getting into like pornographic descriptions of Jonestown, which is like very popular descriptions of like all the Jonestown evil. There were beatings, obviously. At one point, they actually had this thing called the Board of Education, which is literally a paddle, like a wooden paddle. You can use that to like whack people like on their behinds for violating temple policy. And it wasn't just 1 or 2 whacks. It was like you can get up to like 75, 100 whacks.
Yeah, so I wasn't really bringing this up to kind of like, salaciously focus on the details, but just to kind of, because I know these details did come out, and that brought a lot of kind of aspersion upon the church, which...
Yes, and like some of the other stuff would be like rubber tubing, also boxing sessions where you had to lose because the other person was a representation of socialism in the entire community, and you had to lose to socialism. I apologize for the salacious detail. Like, unfortunately, many of these salacious details are very, very, very much well known in the story of People's Temple. It's unavoidable when you actually do a study about it, because this is what people were focusing on in 1979.
Yeah, so, well, I mean, also before that, too, right? Because, I mean, it wasn't part of... in my understanding, part of the reason that they left for Guyana was because of some of the negative press they were getting.
Yes. Like, part of the reason they left for Guyana was literally because of negative press. There was this article that was going to be published by New West. And members of the temple hierarchy were very, very scared of what would come out. When the eight revolutionaries defected, Jim Jones took it personally. He thought it was a literal betrayal of himself. And he was scared that they were going to expose all of the catharsis sections and stuff, and the fake healings and things, and otherwise impugn on his name and his church. And so when this New West article, which he presumed was going to be filled with negative press about the church, was going to come out, he basically was hysterical. The New West reporters reported like harassment for days on end from temple members saying like, we want to take this stuff down. And even before then, they were scared there was conspiracy against them, and that the defectors would want to try to shut this church down for what they were doing. And they were terrified. And of course, by the end of July of 1977, Jim Jones was in Guyana, and he would never leave Guyana for the rest of his life.
I guess the question becomes, why Guyana? Because it seems like a very odd choice. I mean, I would assume most people probably couldn't even find it on a map.
A lot of people, when they first heard of Guyana, and after the mass suicides in 1978 and into 1979, they didn't know where Guyana was. They thought Guyana was in Africa. Guyana is not in Africa. Guyana is a country in South America. It's a country on the northern end of South America. It's also the only English-speaking country in South America. It also promoted a socialist government run by black leaders.
So was this kind of Jim Jones and the People's Temple saying like, look, there is a place, a country that resembles the world we're trying to build? Yeah.
For them, the world they wanted to build was a socialist country, one that had promised equality for everyone and escaped from racism and classism and sexism and ageism. Jim Jones promoted Guyana as literally the promised land. This was the land where they could be free to be themselves, where they could escape what they believed was a fascist, capitalistic, decaying corpse of what America was. They believed that America had a great promise, but that it was decaying, just as being taken over by fascist groups wanting to suppress people's rights and wanting to send Black people to concentration camps and stuff. And Guyana was this like paradise to them. This was how it was portrayed by Temple media and stuff.
How many people actually went with Jim Jones originally to found what would become known as Jonestown?
The first group of settlers who were sent there to build Jonestown was about 50 people. They got sent there in, I believe, 1973. And they were going to be there to basically build the community from scratch in the middle of an isolated jungle on the northwestern corner of Guyana, which is about 30 miles away from the Venezuelan border. They were basically there to do grunt work. It is the jungle. It is hot. It is humid. There are snakes and other random wild animals fooling around. The trees are thick and hard cut down. And they were sent there to clear this place up, to start planting crops, and to build living spaces for her future incoming migrants.
When Jones gets there in 1977, I mean, it sounds like there's probably like a semi-functioning community, though.
Yeah, there was. Like, they did actually build a number of cottages and dormitories, as well as a communal kitchen, a cage for their pet chimpanzee, Mr. Muggs, office, a couple of restrooms and stuff. And, of course, they had fields planted. And so there was a small functioning area. The only problem was that they hadn't built enough living space, because initially they were imagining like maybe 4 people in a cottage, and that they were going to house like maybe like 500 people. When Jim Jones came to immigrate to Guyana for the very last time in 1977, this triggered a mass migration of People's Temple members. And at some point, we get hit like over 1,000 people in Jonestown.
Yeah, and out of that 1,000, I mean, what proportion of the church membership traveled down to Jonestown? You know, how many people stayed back in the United States?
There were a number of people who did stay back in the United States. At this point, the temple actually claimed around like several tens of thousands of members. In reality, it was probably maybe closer to around 3,000 to 5,000 people, which is still a lot of people. Mm-hmm. But the number of people who went down to Guyana was only a small portion of the number of people who had temple membership. Nevertheless, the people in Guyana were some of the most dedicated members of People's Temple.
Yeah, and how did the actual government of Guyana take to 1,000 people suddenly immigrating all at once to this new town?
Well, it wasn't literally all at once. It was literally spread out over the course of like 2 or 3 months. The story goes that had Jim Jones called up the Guyanese government and was like, "Hey, I'm gonna go send down like a bunch of people down to your country. Is that okay?" And the government of Guyana was like, "What? Like, we have to do all this processing and stuff." And he was like, and then Jim Jones was like, "But no, wait, I have this like check for like $500,000. I'm gonna go deposit this in a bank in Guyana." And of course, Guyana at this time, its economy was not great, and so Jim Jones was like, "Oh, I also have like this bunch of money. I'm going to go deposit in Guyana, and also these people are being persecuted from the United States because of their beliefs and skin color, and also so they all need a refuge, and also these people have skills that could contribute to the Guyanese economy." And the Guyanese economy was like, "Oh, okay." And they let them.
So he sold it as just kind of like, "Hey, I'm going to bring an influx of money and skilled laborers into your country." Yes.
That's pretty much what happened.
Yeah. So, when they get down to Guyana, it sounds like there's a message of persecution that's really been kind of running through the temple leadership and the temple kind of ideology, with this idea of that they're being persecuted, and now they've had to flee flee America, which is a brutal global dictator. I mean, did that intensify down in Guyana?
Yes, it did. It intensified to the point where you actually start getting white knights. A white knight, in the context of People's Temple in Jonestown, was essentially a period of heightened crisis.
And this is a night as in nighttime, not night as in guy on horse.
Yeah, night as in nighttime. And white, because according to Jones's reasoning, white is the opposite of black. And because black has often been used as the negative term, he used white instead. So white night instead of black night. Terminology is weird. Anyways, so they had these white nights, which is basically the like crisis events. The very first one being the 6-day siege, where people of members of Jonestown would be were scared that had the CIA or the Guyanese National Army or whatever would like come in and like kill Jim Jones or try to arrest him or something like that. And so they lined themselves up, they armed themselves with like farm implements and machetes and stood around the perimeter of the community for 6 days. The trigger point for that one was actually a child custody case.
Because this case actually, I believe, becomes very important because I know when I was reading over or listening over and reading the transcript for what's been called the death tape, which is kind of the final recorded moments of the People's Temple, this case comes up a lot. So give us an idea about what this was.
Jim Jones used to have this couple named Tim and Grace Stowen. Tim Stowen was his chief lieutenant and a very high-ranking member of Temple leadership. He met his future wife, Grace, and the two of them got married. The two of them got married and had a child named John Victor Stowen. His birth certificate was listed Tim Stowen as father. However, shortly after John Victor Stowen was born, Tim Stowen signed an affidavit saying, I did not sire this child. I asked Jim Jones to sire this child for me because Grace wanted a kid, and since I was so impotent I couldn't do it myself, I asked my pastor to do it for me because he was the best person I knew. Roughly said that. Unfortunately, this affidavit may basically cause this confusion as to who his father was. Some years later, Grace defected from the temple. She said, it's been said that she basically joined the temple initially because as like her husband, and when he married her, said like, hey, I'll give you this 1 year's commitment to the temple, so that way I can marry you. And it's been said she didn't actually really believe in like temple stuff, but that doesn't matter. Anyways, Grace leaves I believe in 1976, and she left her son behind. Sometime later, her husband defects from the temple. At that point, Grace herself was beginning to fight for custody for her son, who she had left behind. When her now ex-husband defected, he also left his son behind. Both of them had their reasons for leaving their son behind. Jones might have said, like, oh, like, if you're taking your son with you, like, it would be disruptive for him. And it's possible that Grace was scared that, like, Jones would do something to her kid or something like that. Whatever the reason, both the Stones left their son behind when they both defected at different points. Later, Tim Stowen teamed up with his now ex-wife to get custody of their kid back.
And the kid is in Guyana. Yes.
At that point, the kid had been moved to Guyana. In Guyana, California court cases are not legally enforceable. So you actually need a Guyanese court order.
And I take it that the Guyanese courts were not particularly interested in advocating this case.
Actually, what happened was that there was a arrest warrant for Jim Jones to bring John Victor Stowen to court and to explain why he wouldn't be held in contempt. Because the Stowen's attorney had come down and had argued the custody case itself might have taken a while for it to resolve, but then like they did send out a arrest warrant for Jim Jones to bring this child to court to present him. This literally triggered the 6-day siege. They tried serving the warrants, and the people of Jonestown absolutely refused to accept them. And of course, Jim Jones would never leave Jonestown for like ever, because if he left, he might have gotten arrested and be forced to face a guy, Georgetown judge. In addition,
so this is kind of what's fueling a lot of the paranoia here.
Yeah. Also, this was Jones's explanation as to why he refused. His reasoning was that if he was forced to give this child up, this child who he claimed to be his own flesh and blood, and if he cannot be prevented from giving up his flesh and blood to defectors of the opposition, If he could not keep his own flesh and blood safe from fascists, then what power would he have to protect the rest of his community from being taken the same way? And so this child became a symbol of what both sides wanted. Jim Jones wanted to keep his community, Jonestown, like together. And the opposition wanted to take their family members home and break apart the community.
Now, at some point, a U.S. congressman from California actually gets involved in this case, right?
Yeah. This is Leo Ryan. Leo Ryan was, I believe, a House of Representatives. He got attracted to this case because his friend and son died mysteriously in a train accident. And so he got attracted to this case, trying to investigate what happened. Ultimately, he got in contact with members of concerned relatives, the opposition group of the temple, which consisted of former members and relatives of people in Jonestown. He got in touch with these members, and part of his goal was to find out what the heck was going on in Jonestown. But the other goal was to take out anyone who concerned relatives was convinced really, really wanted to leave, to take them out and take them home to the United States. And the people in Jonestown, they did not get notice that he was going to visit until the very beginning of very early November 1978. He had been preparing for this trip for several months beforehand, going to the State Department and trying to get media and reporters down to Guyana to report on the story. But Jonestown, the community itself, didn't get noticed until a couple weeks before he was scheduled to arrive. This basically, he scared a lot of people in Jonestown, because at this point, this is Congressman Leo Ryan, a representative of this government who they believed was going to destroy them, this fascist government that they were trying to get away from. And with him were the media, who they believed was conspiring with the government to take them down, and were responsible for much of their negative press. And also, they were being followed by members of the opposition group Concerned Relatives, many of them who had defected from the temple early on and were now using all the energy that they used to put forward for the temple against it.
So what was the plan then to head off this this dissolution of the church by the forces of the American government?
They basically did hidden number dance. They were panicking, and so many of them signed a petition saying, "We do not want Congressman Ryan to come into our community." Most of the community members in Jonestown, about 1,000 of them so this time, signed it because they did not want him in their community. This was private property, understand. They had a right to say, "No, we don't want you to come into our community." And Congressman Ryan, he was making it very clear that he did not care that it was private property. If he couldn't come in, he was going to go back to the United States and report that this was literally a cult who had something to hide. But they were scared that if he came in, he would rent the community into two.
Yeah, but he was eventually allowed in, correct?
Yes, he was. It took several days in negotiation. Eventually, Jonestown residents eventually did invite him in, and a number of concerned relatives and most of the media crew. Congressman Ryan, I believe, arrived on November 15th, and then November 16th was him trying to gain access to Jonestown. And finally, on the evening of November 17th, his group finally got permission to go into Jonestown.
And so what did they find? I mean, assuming they were going in expecting that a lot of people would want to leave, but what did they actually find?
He went in and he started doing interviews and stuff of some of the people who concerned relatives back at home said that they probably really secretly wanted to leave. He was treated to dinner, later on to entertainment by the Jonestown Express, which is basically the community band. The enthusiasm during this entertainment part was like contagious. There's some NBC footage like lying around where you hear the singer just like soulfully sing. Like everyone was like happy and like clapping and stuff. And Marcelin Jones invites Congressman Leo Ryan to come up and speak. And he basically says, paraphrasing, that he gets the impression that for some of these people in there, that Jonestown was the best thing that had ever happened to them. All of a sudden, applause! Like, people who were applauding, like, super happily and cheering and all this stuff. And of course, like, you get to the impression that it's all starting to go well. This might actually be okay. But then, and a note gets slipped by Bernard Goosley. He and Monica Bagby had wanted to leave Jonestown for some months. This was their opportunity to get out. And so they passed a note to one of the cameramen to pass on to eventually to Leo Ryan, saying, we really want to leave Jonestown. Please help us get out. And some people did notice that a note was being passed. A kid said, I believe the story goes that like the note got dropped. And then he said, and he picked it up and put it back and was like, oh, you dropped this, sir. And then another kid said, no. Oh, he passed a note to you. What's right? He was passing this note. He did. And it's like, it was hysterical. And eventually, the Congressman Leo Ryan and his staff were allowed to stay overnight in Jonestown, whereas as members in the media had to, and I believe the Dixon relatives had to leave and find shelter at Port Kaituma, several miles away.
Yeah, okay. And so he's leaving the next morning, correct? Knowing that some people want to leave, but also having seen that a lot of people apparently did not. So well, how many people actually left with him?
Let's start from the beginning of November 18th. Leo Ryan was actually planning to stay in Jonestown for several days, check out the community and stuff. And of course, the press members, in that like a number of people wanted to leave, decided to use this opportunity to hound Jones for his very last interview on tape. It's like asking him like about the allegations by the concerned relatives, and about how he felt about people leaving, and then a number of people found out that some members wanted to leave. And then all of a sudden, like, we also start getting, like, other people wanted to leave. Like, the Parks family, most of the members of the Parks family wanted to leave. I believe the Borges family also themselves wanted to leave the community. And then, of course, within all this chaos, a group of 11 people who had been planning this escape for some time, who finally found this as an opportunity to leave, snuck out of Jonestown, claiming they were going on a picnic and running, pretty much. Ultimately, I believe we get like 11 people who left earlier that day, and then I believe 19 people left with Congressman Ryan. We get to the point where like Congressman Ryan had to call in another plane to move all of the defectors. But ultimately, the number of defectors compared to the larger community was like maybe 1% of the community.
I mean, it's at max a couple dozen people, but this is a community of over 1,000 at this point.
Yes. So it wasn't that many people who wanted to leave on that particular day.
Well, so what was the reaction to these, defections?
Jim Jones, at this point, he is super stoked. He was ridiculously paranoid, and now he suddenly finds out that a number of people wanted to leave. And while this was only like a small number of his Jonestown residents, many of the people who wanted to leave were longtime standing members of the temple. Like the Parks family had been members of People's Temple ever since Indianapolis.
Did Jones give the order to have them attacked?
We don't know. Jim Jones tends to take a lot of things personally. He took this personally. On the other hand, we don't actually know whether Jim Jones ordered a group of people to follow the truck of defectors and shoot at them. We know from the death tape that he knew about it, as he talks about how someone on one of the planes is going to kill the pilot and shoot the plane down, which presumably means that Larry Layton, who got on the transport last minute.
Larry Layton is a People's Temple member.
Yes. He was a loyalist. He got on to the defector's truck with a gun. He started shooting inside a plane once he was allowed on board. And presumably he was the person who was going to take down one of the planes, like, once it took flight, except for the fact that the shooting happened before they left. But we don't know whether he was informed of it after the fact, while they were leaving or something like that, or whether he ordered it.
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, the end result is that Congressman Ryan is actually killed.
Yes. We get this bunch of people about to board a plane, and then there's people from People's Temple in a red tractor, being pulled by a red tractor. And they show up, and they start shooting. And they were terrified. Many of them, like, scattered, trying to hide. And then they came up and shot certain people like at point blank range. Boom, 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 boom. 5 people died on that airstrip that day, and a number of others were seriously wounded. The 5 people who died being obviously Leo Ryan, a defector, and then Dream members of the press. NBC cameraman Bob Brown, Don Harris is, I believe, one of the deaths, and then I forgot who the third one is. I believe it was Greg Robinson of the San Francisco Examiner, and defector Patricia Parks.
You know, at this point, all of their fears, the People's Temple, essentially has been kind of self-realized, because it's one thing to be investigated, it's another thing to, you know, buy congressmen, it's another thing to have your members shoot him dead on an airstrip. So when the people in Jonestown hear about this, I mean, I believe this brings us up to, you know, what's famously known as the death tape. Yeah,
Q042 is the FBI classification number. It's known as this death tape because it is literally approximately a 45-minute recording of presumably the last several hours of Jonestown. We presume it's going to be several hours because there's a number of edits and jumps. Like they started and stopped the tape at some point.
Yeah, so what is the actual content of this?
I would break it down in like about 3 parts. The first part would be Jones saying like, we need to commit suicide. We need to die because there's really no way out now. And like, it would be glorious for us to die for our beliefs, for socialism. The second part is a debate session between Christine Miller, who is a Black senior woman, and Jim Jones. And Christine Miller starts out her dissent with, is it too late for Russia?
What's the significance of that?
Previously, members of the Temple leadership had actually looked into moving the community from Guyana to other countries.
To Russia, presumably.
Yes. The big one being Russia. But there had been discussions of like moving to Cuba as well. Many of the members believed the community might actually end up moving to Russia. There were plans possibly immigrate to the Soviet Union. And there were Russian classes where the people of Jonestown were actually starting to learn Russian in case they actually did move to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, so she was asking, you know, why can't we go to Russia?
Yes. Is it too late?
Like we planned.
Yes. And much of the debate was basically like, is it too late for Russia? Russia wouldn't want us because we are tainted now by this death. We're tainted by this murder. Why would they want us? We're worthless now because we murdered someone. And then Christine Miller, why should we die? If we die, what was the point?
I actually have a little piece of audio that I want to play. It's just a couple minutes. So, and this is just kind of the towards the tail end of this debate between the two. So here it goes.
When we destroy ourselves, we're defeated. We let them, the enemy, defeat us.
Did you see I live to fight no more forever?
Yes, I saw that.
Did you not have some sense of pride and victory in that man? He would not subject himself to the will and whim of people who tell that they're going to come in whenever they please and push into our house, come when they please, take who they want to, talk to who they want to. Is that living? That's not living to me. That's not freedom. That's not the kind of freedom I sought.
But I think where they made their mistake is when they stopped to rest. If they had gone on, they would have made it. But they stopped to rest.
It's over, sister. It's over. We made that day. We made a beautiful day. And let's make it a beautiful day. That's what
We win when we go down. Tim Stone has nobody else to hate. He has nobody else to hate. Then he'll destroy himself. I'm speaking here not as the administrator. I'm speaking as a prophet today. I wouldn't step in this seat and talk so serious if I didn't know what I was talking about. If there's any way to call back the immense amount of damage that's going to be done. But I cannot separate myself from the pain of my people. You can't either, Christine, if you stop to think about it. You can't separate yourself. We've walked too long together.
I know that, but I still think as an individual, I have a right to...
You do, and I'm listening.
What I think, what I feel, and I think we all have a right to our own destiny as individuals.
Right.
And I think I have a right to choose mine, and everybody else has a right to choose theirs.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Mm-hmm. I'm not criticizing. I'm not doing this. What's that? Said today. That's what 20 people said today with their lives.
I think I still have a right to my own opinion.
I'm not taking it from you. I'm not taking it from you.
Christine, you're only standing here because he was here in the first place. So I don't know what you're talking about, having an individual life. Your life has been extended to the day that you're standing there because of him.
Voice back there, she has as much right to speak to anybody else, too. What'd you say, Luby? Well, you'll regret it this very day if you don't die. You'll regret it if you don't die. You'll regret it.
Too many people.
I saved them, but I made my example. I made my expression. I made my manifestation, and the world was not ready for me. Paul said, I was a man born out of due season. I've been born out of due season just like all we are, and the best testimony we can make is to leave this goddamn world.
Yeah, so what we heard there was the voice of Christine Miller speaking with Jim Jones, who had a very kind of pronounced slurring of his words there. He was apparently on some very heavy medications. And another man and some other people in the background as well. And Christine Miller was really kind of strongly argued against this and just was looking for alternatives. But could you give us a little bit about what that interaction tells us about Jonestown at that time?
It's been argued by the members of the opposition that everyone just all got the same day, because if they didn't, they would get punished, right? But then in Jonestown itself, on the tape, Jim Jones himself would tell Miller that he liked her because of the fact that she had this sucking of pains. In addition, Jim Jones would mention a number of names, one of being Tim Stowen, who I've introduced earlier as one of the chief opponents.
This was the father in the custody case.
Yes. And the other person, Deanna Myrtle, who later on in her life would go by Jeannie Mills, who helped found the Concerned Relatives group and who founded the Human Freedom Center and was hoping that number of Jonestown residents would come through her center and deprogram themselves back into away from Jonestown and back into society.
Yeah, but this is basically just a listing of all the enemies against them.
Yes. And then, of course, like some of it's about revolutionary suicide, which has been promoted in previous White Nights, and the idea that it is good to die for their beliefs, and that hopefully, like, their deaths will be seen as a protest against the wider society. And in much of the debate itself, it's basically him arguing against Christine, saying, like, this is the reason why we have to die. We have no worth. There's no way Russia would accept us. How would we even get to Russia if Russia would even accept us? Would Russia, like, accept us right now? Would they be able to evacuate us before Guyanese Defense Force will come in parachutes and kill us and our kids?
So one of the things I also noticed that there's a big strain of this idea that if we don't die now, we're going to be murdered anyway.
Yeah.
And I actually have another little clip of audio I want to play, and this is just it's a young man. I don't know his actual name in the transcript. He's unidentified, but he talks about preferring to die like this as opposed to the way the Jews did. So I'm going to play that.
Of the children here, a great deal because of Jim Jones. And the way the children are laying there now, I'd rather see them laid like that than to see them have to die like the Jews did, which was pitiful anyhow. And I'd just like to thank Dad for giving us life and also death. And I appreciate the fact, the way our children are going. Because like Dad said, when they come in, what they're going to do to our children, they're going to massacre our children. And also the ones that they take captured, they're going to just let them grow up and be dummies like they want them to be, and not grow up to be a socialist like the one and only Jim Jones. So I'd like to thank Dad for our opportunity for letting Jonestown be not what it could be, but what Jonestown is. Thank you, Dad.
Yeah, so we have this young man speaking, and this is later on, I should say. I believe this is after they've actually started giving the poison flavor aid to the children. But you can see in that there's this fear of not only that, you know, that some outside force is going to come and kill them, but also it's going to take them away and raise them up like dummies. And also this heavy emphasis on socialism. So, I mean, can you put that in the context then?
Well, previously at this point, America has been made out to this like fascist, capitalistic, decadent society that wants to promote racism, that wants to destroy any socialist thought, that wants to basically turn people into like mindless corporate machines or something like that. To them, America was literally what they wanted to get away from because America represented everything they didn't want.
I think the big question is, you know, is always like, why would people do this? And I think that the past couple audio clips that we played and what we've been talking about is that it seemed like there was a sense of inevitability, that if they didn't take their own lives, they would either be killed or they would be forced back into that, you know, that demonized, hellish depiction of America. Yeah,
and neither of them were acceptable to members of the community. Both of them, to them, were not much better than death. If they died by their own hands, they would die with dignity because they decided when they made their exit.
Yeah, and this is Jones's revolutionary suicide.
Yeah, sort of. They decided they were going to die for this purpose and that they themselves chose when to die. Someone else did not choose it for them. Someone else did not kill them or force them back into a life that to them was worse than that.
Of course, the end result then is 918 men, women, and children end up drinking poison and dying.
916. Two of them died by gun. One of them being Jim Jones, who we don't know if it was a homicide or suicide. Also Annie Moore, who also drank poison and also shot herself in the head. We don't actually know whether which one of them killed her, so both of them were given as reasons for her death. But yes, 918 people died in Jonestown that day. We don't know how many of them died willingly. It is basically believed that 1/3 of them, the children, could not have died willingly. He was suicidal intent because they're children and therefore could not consent to
and also they had previous kind of like on these white nights, they'd had previous instances where they, you know, faked drinking poisoned, a poison drink.
That happening. There was one instance of them fake drinking poison, and death and suicide have been normalized through assignments for Jonestown residents. There is actually a series of letters recovered from the Jonestown site, presumably in response to an assignment saying what they would do during the final white night, and many of them, including children, said that they were willing to become suicide bombers or to take out their enemies and ultimately to commit suicide in the name of socialism. For these people, since they've been conditioned to accept death and suicide as normal aspects of life.
Who actually discovered the bodies then? You know, because presumably people came looking for the congressman who was scheduled to return. You know, the people who had escaped the attack reported that to the authorities. So, you know, who were the first responders on that scene who discovered this?
First responders were the Guyanese Defense Force. Generally, this trip to Jonestown wouldn't take more than an hour, but because there were reports of gunshots, they were scared that Jonestown residents were up and armed and ready to mow them down. And so they walked through the jungle slowly. And
so they were the Guyanese Defense Force was not exactly ready and raring to go fight a bunch of suicidal cultists.
Yeah, pretty much. So they went through walking forward slowly to avoid gunfire and to avoid aggravating the Jonestown community.
Yeah.
Right?
And what was the reaction when the news of this mass suicide started getting out?
So the media started reporting rumors of a mass suicide on November 19th. It was confirmed that it was a mass suicide by November 21st. Initially, media reports reported that only around 400 people died. This was a grossly underestimated number, considering the fact that we know now that 918 people died.
Also,
But
only 400 or so people is kind of a that's a bit of a rosy spin on only.
Yeah, and so a lot of people, a lot of relatives at home, were hoping that the relatives might have actually survived this, that they might have run off. There's letters from the Moore family where some of them were hoping that like their daughters, at least one of their daughters had run away into the jungle and had escaped her. Like if she had been shot, that she had died resisting, that she had died while refusing to give poison to babies. And then eventually they started evacuating the bodies. And then they noticed that many of the bodies were covering up bodies of children, like small children. And so the numbers just went up. And so eventually we get to 918 people dead. Outside of like a few couple dozen survivors in the Jonestown area on that day. And excluding the number of people in Georgetown itself on that day doing temple work, there was no survivors. Outside of those two groups, there were no survivors. And the media went in a frenzy. I alluded to earlier about like details about beatings and deaths and suicide. There was a book that came out the title is literally "Hold Hands and Die," and the cover picture was a picture of a family lying face down, like holding each other by the shoulders with a child in between the two of them. It's very tragic, and it's very, very sad. And on the front covers of Newsweek and Time magazine, we have pictures of people, like dead people, surrounding the pavilion, surrounding a vat of purple liquid, presumably the poison. And the title is Cult of Death. And we get stories about how like these people were literally cultists, brainwashed. And people were wondering why? Why did people die? How does this happen? This is from the Birmingham Post on November 21st, 1978. It takes a lot now to startle the Western world, which has been made insensitive to the shock in the 20th century by insensate examples of collective madness. But one may suspect that, even in a world of bizarre happenings, the bizarre horror story emerging from the settlement of People's Temple religious cult at Jonestown, Guyana, have been received with almost incredulous surprise. Such is the capacity of the United States to generate strange, unlovely, and often fanatical sects, which gain a dangerous hold over the minds of their followers, that the temptation might be to conclude that the New World, in attracting the outcasts and unwanted of the rest of the world, must have drawn more than its fair share of the crackpots and gullible. Any such complacency would be unwarranted, as quite a cursory story of history would prove. The fact that is that man, in spite of his all too high opinion of himself, is only too liable to mass reactions to stimuli that lead him into collective madness and wickedness, which can be on a vast scale. What causes a Jonestown bout of madness and wickedness to make such a marked impact on dulled world sensibilities is on a small enough scale to be completely comprehensible.
So there's this perception that, these people were brainwashed and led into it, but that this was kind of one of those things that, that the Birmingham Post article, you said, I'm reminded a lot of the way that people talk about things like the Stanford prison experiment, or the Stanley Milgram test, where anyone can descend into sort of psychological madness.
Yeah, here's another one from the Oakland Tribune on November 22nd, 1978. The emotionalism over Guyana shouldn't be allowed to prompt witch hunts against anybody who belongs to a cult or commune. Nobody's calling for investigations of every commune in the country, yet. But the thinking could go this way. Jim Jones once hobnobbed with the country's leading politicians. If he can persuade 400 people to kill themselves, what are some of the other cultists going to do? The authorities had better find out before it's too late. After all, situations far milder than Guyana lead to the inquisitions and witch hunts of the past. Admittedly, nobody is likely to be hung as a witch in the 20th century, but it's a fair bet there would be calls for spying on small cults throughout the country in the name of preventing another Guyana. It's easy to visualize someone who was upset by a commune next door demanding an investigation and whispering, "Remember Guyana."
Now, this did actually lead to a kind of a backlash against cults, because I think one of the things, if you look at the history of the United States in like the 60s and the 70s, there are a lot of these kind of like, kind of culty seeming kind of groups popping up. But Jonestown kind of puts a shadow over all of that.
Yeah, because the events of what happened in Jonestown fueled what was the anti-cult movement and became pretty much the face of what would happen if you did not do anything against these new religious movements. These groups, were outside what we consider normal. Anyone now who was ever in a commune or who was ever in a group that is not a mainstream group, they are now being accused of being suicidal cults that will eventually lead to the mass deaths of many, many people. And this is considered the inevitable end of what happens if you did not take measures to investigate these communes, to investigate these groups that lay outside of mainstream society. And it's through this that helped this demonization of the people of Jonestown, and drew this dehumanization, and drew this kind of othering that helped fuel this morality play. If you go outside of established beliefs and join a group that has alternate established beliefs that do not follow within our mainstream, you will eventually die because you will be brainwashed. And
so what is, to kind of bring us to a conclusion here, how should we understand Jonestown then?
Ultimately, much of the earlier scholarship of Jonestown was about how Jonestown was actually a cult, and how we should have done more to prevent Jonestown by investigating it earlier, or questioning the motives of the members of the concerned relatives and of the anti-cult movement. There was actually literally one book which claimed that the defectors were literally saints, because they were like ex-drug addicts trying to get other drug addicts outside the cycle of addiction and try to cure them, which obviously has very, very, very unfortunate implications. It started changing in the 1980s as people began to question how, instead of how can we prevent another Jonestown, people began asking what was Jonestown and how did Jonestown reflect American society as a whole. And so people began studying Jonestown instead of how can we avoid being this other group. This new scholarship started coming out asking, how is Jonestown like this other group? How does Jonestown reflect on American society, upon American culture? Was Jonestown American? Was Jonestown a religious group? How did Jonestown fit in within the wider religious community? Because as early on many of the religious groups came out and said, Jonestown is not us. Jonestown was not a religion. Jonestown was just a cult. And then a new scholarship was coming out saying, but you can understand Jonestown as a religious group. This is basically a salvation and suicide, pretty much. And then the Gone from the Promised Land is a study of how Jonestown and People's Temple was inherently an American movement, and how Jonestown and People's Temple reflected American society while also subverting it. Even more recent scholarship now is focusing on why people wanted to join People's Temple and who the people were, instead of assuming that everyone in Jonestown would secretly wanted to leave and that they had all been brainwashed. We're starting to ask, why did they choose to stay? We're starting to give these people back their agency. And this is where current scholarship is now, giving these people back their agency and to remove the stigma of other.
Well, Cordes, I want to thank you for talking to us about this rather tragic event in American history, and as something as a way to repersonify and put it in context. And as always, thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this Christmas gift of a suicidal death cult. Again, it wasn't supposed to really work out like that. But, who knows? Maybe next year we'll have something fun and Christmassy on Christmas instead of. But I hope in listening you've kind of gained a better and more thorough understanding of why people would, drink the Kool-Aid, technically Flavor-Aid, at Jonestown and Guyana. And what attracted people to join the People's Temple in the first place. We spent a lot of time in the very beginning. Well, we spent a lot of time at the end talking about how people saw this as kind of this symbol of how people could be duped by this charismatic, megalomaniacal cult leader. But when you contrast that, we were talking about in the very beginning of the episode about how the message was about bringing equality between people, integrating the church, setting up the socialist utopia where everyone is equal and everyone is respected. That's a very compelling message of equality and tolerance. And you can see how people, especially people who are living disadvantaged in society, whether they're poor or whether they're a minority, could be attracted to that message. And so it makes a lot more sense that, these people who had been, in the church for so many years and gone through all these tribulations and kind of, been in this bubble where it was them against the world, could finally undergo that final act. So hopefully that makes it a little more understandable. And hopefully the next time someone says, accuses you of drinking the Kool-Aid, you hear someone else getting accused of drinking the Kool-Aid, you can, jump into the conversation with some facts and details and nuance and contextualize the situation and also remind them that it wasn't just Kool-Aid. So if you like the episode, of course, feel free to rate and review us on iTunes. That keeps us bubbling and burbling in their recommended posts. So the next time you want to discuss one of the largest mass suicides in history, you can do that with other people who have listened to this episode. And I hope you checked out some of our past episodes. We've been having a great run of past episodes. We're going to have a great run coming up as well. We're going to be talking next week, or in 2 weeks, I should say. We'll be talking about Haitian voodoo, particularly looking at the way it's kind of been looked at by people who are not practitioners of it. So again, that's continuing our streak of taking complicated issues that are usually misunderstood and explaining them in great, wonderful detail. And then after that, we're going to be looking at the state of kind of the political state of Europe after the fall of Rome, looking at relations between Byzantium or Constantinople at that time, and these rising Germanic kingdoms in the West, in France and in Italy and in Spain and in North Africa as well. So I hope you come by and enjoy those episodes with us as well. Again, rate and review us on iTunes so people know what you're talking about when you want to talk about these things. Rate and review us on whatever else you happen to be listening on. We're on a wide variety of streaming services, so we should be available wherever you choose to put your ears. We have a SoundCloud account, which has the last couple episodes. You can also check out all the past episodes on AskHistorians.libsyn.com. And of course, there's a discussion post that goes up on the subreddit after every single one of those episodes. So if you have any questions or comments, you can come by and stop there. And of course, we do have, as I mentioned at the start, we do have a Patreon. So if you want to support the podcast and help us grow and expand and do other fun, neat things, feel free to go by patreon.com/AskHistorians and donate. Until then, in 2 weeks, we will see you.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.